My dear friends in Christ, welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation titled The Apocalipsa, the good news from Patmos. In our last presentations, we began our consideration of the special vision of the book of Revelation called the seven trumpets of the Apocalypse. We saw that this series begins with special introductory vision, and we concluded with a question about really the theological meaning of the seven trumpets in the book of Revelation. Just to remind you that every time when we have some difficult text of the book of Revelation, symbols that we are struggling to understand, the best way to get the understanding of the meaning of certain vision or biblical text, we should go to the Old Testament to remind you that most of the symbols of the book of Revelation are taken to the Old Testament, from the Old Testament, and the best way to get the understanding of that is really to find out the meaning of that symbol that had in the Old Testament. So, in order to understand seven trumpets, we have to understand about the meaning of the trumpets in the history of God's people, Israel, in the Old Testament. A careful reading of the Old Testament shows that the life of ancient Israel was closely connected with the blowing of the trumpets. Trumpets were an inseparable part of human lives in ancient Israel. In order to understand it, we will go to the key Old Testament text that really provides us the insight into the meaning of the trumpets among ancient Israelites in the Old Testament, which will really shed some light on the meaning of the trumpets in the book of Revelation. The key text is found in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, and we will read verses 1 to 10. This is, to remind you, the key text for the theological understanding of the trumpets in the Old Testament and also in the book of Revelation, as we already pointed before. So let's read the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Make for yourself 2 trumpets of silver, of hammered work. You shall make them, and you shall use them for summoning the congregation and for having the camps set out. When both are blown, all the congregation shall gather themselves to you at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Yet if only one is blown, then the leaders, the heads of the divisions of Israel, shall assemble before you." And then you have the descriptions how the trumpets were blown. But now we will read our very important text, verses 8 to 10. It says, "The priestly sons of Aaron, the priests, shall blow the trumpets, and these shall be for you perpetual statutes throughout your generations. When you go to war in your land against the adversary who attacks you, then you shall sound alarm with the trumpets, that you may be remembered before the Lord your God, and be saved from your enemies. Also in the days of your gladness and in your appointed feast, and on the first day of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings, over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be as a reminder of you before God. I am the Lord your God." This text gives us the insights into some difficult questions on the significant trumpets in the book of Revelation. As you can see, that the lives of ancient Israel were defined by the blowing of the trumpets. Whether there is a time of a crisis when the enemies were approaching to attack Israel, the trumpet sounds announced, giving the people message to prepare themselves and to take appropriate measures. When people had to go to worship before God, the trumpets announced that very important moment. Or when people during the harvest or during the festivals had to be assembled, the trumpets signal and reminding people of that very important moment. But two things come here very clear out of the text. Number one, those who were in charge of the trumpets, blowing of the trumpets, were the priests, telling us that the trumpets in ancient Israel had very important religious significance. Okay? And number two, the trumpets were not about the people, it was about God. The trumpets really were God's people's call to God, asking God to remember his people and to save them from their enemies, or asking God during the harvest, giving him thanks for great blessings that they were enjoying, but also asking God for the time ahead to bless them also in the future. Whatever people were doing, the trumpets were a signal guiding a people for every occasion. There is one biblical text that actually really sheds more light on what we just read in the book of Numbers, chapter 10. The text is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 14. So 2 Chronicles chapter 13, we read verse 14. It talks about the war situation when the northern kingdom of Israel became the enemy of the kingdom of Judah, who were at that time faithful to God, but Israel were apostate. And it's telling us how Israel, led by their king Jeroboam, actually attacked the kingdom of Judah. Please, let's read the text. It's found in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, okay, verses 12 to 14. Let's read it. It talks that people of Judah said to the people of Israel, "Now behold, God is with us at our head, and he is pleased with the signal trumpets to sound the alarm against you, O sons of Israel. Do not fight against the Lord God of your fathers, for you will be succeed." But Jeroboam, the king of Israel, had set ambush to come from the rear, so that Israel was in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. And when Judah turned around, behold, they were attacked from both front and rear. Now, so they cried to the Lord in prayer, and priests blew the trumpets. Then the men of Judah raised the war cry, and when the men of Judah raised the war cry, then it was that God routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. And when the sons of Israel fled before Judah, God gave them into their hands. You'll notice here in this text, this one of the rare text in the Old Testament that really give us much deeper insights into the meaning of the trumpets. In this case, telling us it's not so much about the trumpets, because the trumpets were associated with the prayers of God's people. They were a call to the people of God to pray to God for help and deliverance in the given moment. So please, pay attention that the trumpets in ancient Israel, they went hand with the prayers of God's people. Now, I would like to invite you one more time that we go back to Revelation chapter 8, to that interlude that we considered in our last presentations. This is exactly what we have in this introductory vision. You remember that this interlude begins with a vision of an angel who took the incense symbolizing the prayers of God's people. He is going there before God and offer those prayers. Did you notice it? Okay, and it is only after the priest offered the prayers to God's people that, according to the Jewish traditions, the priest would blow the trumpets announcing the end of those daily services in the temple. In the context of the book of Revelation, it is only after this event, after the angel offered incense symbolizing the praise of God's people, that the angels are blowing the trumpets. But we still did not get the understanding what really the seven trumpets in the book of Revelation are all about. In the light of that Old Testament background, we want to conclude what really these trumpets are. I would like to ask you a question. What is for you the significance of the statement that John makes that he saw the angel at the altar, which is, as we already stated, the altar of sacrifices, and that it was there at that altar of sacrifices, the angel receives the incense to offer before God, symbolizing the prayers of God's people which were directed to God. What is the significance of that? I would like to suggest to you that this altar, where the prayers of God's people are taken by the angel to be brought before God, is the same altar of sacrifices that John the Revelator saw previously in the vision of the seven seals. Do you remember in the fifth seal, we are talking about the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. John the Revelator, do you remember, saw the altar, which was the altar of sacrifices. And beneath the altar, he saw the blood of God's persecuted people who were martyred because of their faithfulness to God. And that blood is crying to God, asking for the vindication from their adversaries. Do you see in the fifth seal, we have the prayers of God's people? Do you remember the summary of those prayers? How long, the Lord, will you not vindicate our blood on those who live on the earth? Do you remember that God's people, those martyrs in the fifth seal, they got the assurance that they have to be patient and rest for a while until their brothers and their fellow servants, who also have to go through that experience, that they become completed, they have to be perfected. And it is at that altar where those martyr saints were offering prayers to God's people that now John sees that angel who is standing up on that altar. And it is on that place he is taking the incense, symbolizing the prayers of God's people. Which prayers? Those prayers that are described in the fifth seal of Revelation 6, verses 9 to 11. So friends, in the light of this Old Testament background and the context of the whole book, what is the meaning of the trumpets? We saw that the trumpets are associated with God's judgments. But that judgment comes in answer to the prayers of God's people. God's people How long, the Lord? Asking God for the vindication, for the deliverance, and for the redemption. So what are the seven trumpets in the book of Revelation? They are God's judgments over the enemies of his people, persecutors of his people. They are judgments in the answer to the prayers of his people. I believe that this now sheds to us some further lights on the meaning of the seven trumpets in the book of Revelation. The best way to define the seven trumpets as the divine intervention on behalf of God's people throughout the Christian history in answer to God's people as the judgment over those who unjustly persecuted his people because of faithfulness to God and their faithfulness to the preaching of the gospel. As we are going briefly through this text, we will just give you briefly what our current understanding is on those divine interventions in the history of the Christian church on behalf of God's people in answering to their prayers, asking God for the intervention, asking God for the protection. But the caution is necessary. As I told you, the Christians are divided regarding the meaning of the seven trumpets. And evangelical Protestants, unfortunately, there are some Christians, even Seventh-day Adventists, who are impacted by that futuristic approach to the book of Revelation. They say that the seven trumpets are the same as the seven last plagues. So the Christians really who are studying seven trumpets, they associate them with the seven last plagues. We will come and study about the seven last plagues, and they bring the conclusion within the futuristic understanding of the book of Revelation, the seven trumpets are future events that will take place short times before the second coming of Christ. Unfortunately, such understanding is not supported by the evidences from the book of Revelation. You will see that we are studying the seven trumpets, and this introductory vision, it indicates to us that the seven trumpets are taking a place. There is intercession in heaven. This is not the time of the end. There is intercession in heaven. The mercy is still available, and the seven trumpets, while they are punitive, they are judgments in itself. But they are judgments mixed with the mercy, with the call to come people to change the course of their lives and to accept the mercy, while mercy and grace of God is still available. We will come very soon in chapter 10 and 11, and this text is telling us, even with the sixth trumpet, you will see there is still preaching of the gospel. And we know that the gospel is preached to call people to change directions of their lives and come to God and to accept the gospel message in order to be saved. But we will come and we will see that the seven last plagues, they take place when the mercy is not available anymore. I'm using that expression after the close of the probation, where Jesus has finished his intercession there in heaven on behalf of human beings. And every person has sealed its destiny before God without any chance and possibility to repent and to be saved. So please, let's keep in mind The seven trumpets, they cover the same period as the seven seals. They cover the Christian history, while the seven seals focus in particular on God's people during the whole Christian age, from ascension of Jesus to heaven, from the day of Pentecost until the second coming of Christ. The trumpet focus on the same period, but the focus is on the enemies of God's people, on those who try to prevent the preaching of the gospel, causing upon the saints the divine displeasure, and the judgment which comes as God's response to the prayers of his people. I would like to remind you, if you remember, we already talked about that. If you study the seals, okay, carefully, you can see that the seals go into groups of four. You remember, we had 4 horses with the horsemen. Then you have 2 other seals, the 5th and the 6th seal. You remember that. And when you're expecting the 7th seal, there is that interlude, Revelation 7. Chapter 7 is an interlude to answer the question about those who will be able to stand one day before God. They identify the last generation of God's people as the sealed people of God, the number 144,000. The 7 trumpets, they follow the same pattern. You will see that now in chapter 8, we have the first 4 trumpets. Do you see the parallel, the first 4 horses and the horsemen? Then there are trumpets 5 and 6 that brings us to the time of the end. They are very long. They occupy, those 2 trumpets, very long chapter 9. And then you're expecting to have the 7th trumpet. There is another interlude. Chapter 10 and chapter 11 up to verse 15. By interlude in Revelation 7 identifies God's people. Chapter 10 and chapter 11, the second interlude, describes the experience of God's people at the time of the end and the task they're commissioned actually to perform. So you can see the seals and the trumpets, they're organized in the same way because they cover the same period. They cover the whole Christian history from its beginning of the day of Pentecost until the second coming of Christ. So friends, please don't be confused. The trumpets with the 7 last plagues. We will come to 7 last plagues, and we will see that the purpose is completely different. During 7 last plagues, there is no preaching of the gospel. There is no chance to repent. They have completely different purpose from the purpose of the trumpets that are intended even to bring the wicked, those who are hostile to God and the gospel, to bring them back to God, so to be saved. So, with this in mind, we want to make a brief survey to the 7 trumpets. And first we will focus on the first 4 trumpets in the same way as in study of the 7 seals, we focus on the first 4 seals, the first horseman. We will go actually briefly to that. And you will notice, just as introductory thoughts, that the trumpets, especially the first 4, always affect 1/3 of the humanity. They always affect 1/3 of the earth. In the book of Revelation, 1/3 is a part of Satan's kingdom. You will see the end-time Babylon, which describes the end-time apostate religious systems before the second coming of Christ. Its ruins is described as Babylon split into three parts. See, those three parts, which are three parts of Satan's kingdom, when joined together, actually they mark that the end-time apostate system. The fact that they split into three parts, it marks the end of the end-time Babylon. So keep that in mind. You see, the trumpets are not universal in contrast to the 7 last plagues that are, generally speaking, universal. So now I would like to invite you, and we begin reading from verse 6. And we read the following. And the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there were hail and fire mixed with blood. And they were hurled down to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Haven't I told you that the trumpets are, if not the most difficult, but one of the most difficult sections of the book of Revelation to understand? That difficult, but I believe when we have the right approach, they're not as difficult as usually they appear. So what do we have in this vision? Keep in mind the fact that the book of Revelation is a symbolic book. So it's very important to understand the symbolism that is in view here. So we saw when the first angel blows his trumpet, we have the hail and fire mixed with blood are hurled down to this earth. It says that 1/3 of the earth and the trees and all the green grass is burned up. And of course, when you read it carefully and you go to the Old Testament, the event of the first trumpet reminds us a lot of the 7th plague of Egypt that killed both humans and animals in the field, destroyed the plants and the trees that were also in the field. You can read about that in the book of Exodus, chapter 9. So what is the meaning of this symbolism that we have here? In the Old Testament, God used hail mixed with fire, which resulted in the bloodshed, as the means of judgment against the enemies of his people. And there are numerous Old Testament texts about this. In the Bible, trees and grass are frequently symbols for God's people. Thus, hail and fire mixed with blood, which destroys the trees and the green grass, symbolize God's judgment against his people. But this time, they are apostate people of God who have joined the ranks and the oppression of God's people. While addressing the Jewish people, John the Baptist stated that every person who does not bear fruit would be cut down like a tree and thrown into the fire. See, John the Baptist compares God's people with the trees. But Jesus also used the symbolism of the trees with the reference to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he said, if they're doing these things in the green tree, meaning himself, what will happen to the dry tree? Jesus referred to himself as the green tree, and those who rejected him, unfaithful Jews of the time, with the dry trees. When Jesus was so hardly and harshly treated, then what will happen to them? So what is the meaning of the first trumpet? The best way to understand the first trumpet is that God's judgment upon those who are God's people. They used to be God's people, who were involved in persecuting Christ. And they were also responsible for the persecution of the early church. While many Jews accepted Christ, most of them, with their leaders, rejected him and became the opponents of the gospel. As a result, they placed themselves outside of the divine protection and outside of the covenant. Now the first one to experience the consequences of rejecting the covenant. As Peter said in chapter 4, verse 17, the judgment of God begins with the house of God. Just as the Old Testament hail and fire were used as God's judgment against the enemies of Israel, so the sounding of the first trumpet heralds God's judgment in terms of hail and fire against God's own people who rejected the covenant and turned into the oppressors and the persecutors of the followers of Christ. So the best way to understand the first trumpets, it's God's judgment over unfaithful Jerusalem, over the Jewish nation, with the destruction of Jerusalem by Romans that took place in AD 70 to 72. You will notice that the trumpets are always going in pairs, okay? So keep in mind we have the first trumpet. Now we are going to the second trumpet. And we are reading in verse 8 of chapter 8. They said, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with a fire was cast into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. And a third of the creatures which were in the sea, which had life, died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Okay, let's summarize what we have here. At the sound of the second trumpet, something resembling a great burning mountain was cast out in the sea. As a result of that, a third of the sea turned into the blood, killing a third of the sea creatures and wrecking a third ships. Mountains in the Old Testament often symbolize and represent kingdoms or empires that are subjects and objects of God's judgment. You will notice here in the text, this mountain is called the great mountain, which points to the great kingdom or empire. It is a great empire, and this scene alludes to the prophecy of Jeremiah in chapter 51:25, referring to Babylon as destroying mountain, to be judged for its cruelty against Judah as God's people, in Jeremiah 51:24. Babylon will become burning mountain according to Jeremiah. And you see, this is the same language that John also uses in the Revelation 18:21 to describe the demise of the end time Babylon. These Jeremiah prophecies really provides the key for the unlocking of symbolism of the second trumpet. In John's day, Babylon symbolically represented the Roman Empire. For instance, Peter himself, in 1 Peter chapter 5:13, he's sending the greetings to Christians from Babylon. At that time, he was in Rome, so he called Rome to be Babylon. Okay, so the Roman Empire could easily be symbolized as the burning mountain. The turning of the sea into blood and the destruction of the ships reminds of that plague against Egypt, which turned the water into blood and destroyed the fish. The sea in the Bible frequently symbolizes people violently opposing God. So destruction of ships refers to the subjection of human pride. Here again, the phrase 1/3 shows that only a part of Satan's kingdom is affected by the judgment of God. So how to understand this second trumpet, plague, and judgment. How? We already explained that the trumpets run in pairs. While the first judgment is, the first trumpet describes God's judgment over persecutors of Christians and those who crucified Christ, Jewish nation. The best way and all understanding of the second trumpet points to God's judgment to another nation that was also responsible for crucifying Christ and for the persecution of the early church, in an effort to prevent the spreading of the gospel to the world, and that was the Roman Empire. So, the first and the second trumpets, they describe those who were primarily responsible for the death of Christ, his crucifixion on the cross, and the persecution of the early church in an effort to prevent the church from spreading the gospel. Now, the third and the fourth trumpets, they also go into pairs. And now they chronologically follow the first two trumpets. So I would like now to invite you that we read together verses 10 and 11. It says, the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on the third of the rivers and on the spring of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. At the blowing, as you see, of the third trumpet, a great blazing star falls from heaven on the third of the rivers and the spring of waters. We saw that the third of the waters turned bitter. As a result, many people died. Stars, as we saw already earlier, very often in the Bible represent angels. However, this star mentioned here is defined as the great star, which shows that we are dealing with one particular important angel, which is in the Bible point to only one angel, who is in the book of Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15, identified as Lucifer, that mighty angel who at the beginning rebelled against God. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, John describes Satan as the head of the fallen angel who was cast out from heaven down to this earth. This angel, this star, is identified as the wormwood. Wormwood was the herb notorious for its bitterness and poisonous qualities. The wormwood turns the waters bitter, causing many people to die. In the book of Jeremiah, if we go to chapter 9, verses 13 to 15, and chapter 23, 15, when people of Israel turned away from God and spurned the covenant and faithfulness to God, they were given wormwood to eat and poisoned waters to drink. The rivers and springs of water symbolize spiritual nourishment for spiritually thirsty people. However, Satan turned the gospel message into wormwood by producing false teaching and traditions of man. The scene of the third trumpet shows Satan's polluting the springs and streams of truth and salvation with human teaching, causing them to have poisonous and deadly effect. In the second trumpet, we saw that that we have God's judgments on the Roman Empire, and referring to the fall and demise of Rome as the enemy of God's people. If this is true, then the third trumpet concerns the time after the fall of the Roman Empire. Paul warned the early Christians of the approaching apostasy, warning Christians that the false teachers will come and pervert the gospel and introduce false teachings into the church. Also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 1 to 12, Paul predicted of the great apostasy that would invade the Christian church. It will be great rebellion against God. However, this apostasy would not come until the restrainer, the Roman Empire, was removed. So now, with the demise of the Rome and the Roman Empire, the way became open for this approaching apostasy. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the world was plunged into the period of dark Middle Ages. During this period, mainstream Christianity departed from the apostolic teachings, from the gospel, and perverted the teaching of the Bible. Corrupted doctrines crept into the church, replacing the Bible with the tradition and scholastic teachings. The gospel truth was polluted and perverted into a system of dogmas with devastating effects. The institutional church promoted sinful practices that were contrary to the Bible. So the church that once was faithful to God now became the enemy of the gospel and the persecutor of those who decided to remain faithful to God. So the third trumpet, the best way to understand it is as the description of the medieval apostasy of the Christian church and its consequences, the spiritual death of many who drank from the polluted and poisonous distortion of the gospel. Keep in mind that the trumpets are going to pairs. So the trumpet number 4 is a continuation of the third trumpet. So please, I'd like to invite you that we turn and to read verses 12 to 13. And the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were stricken, so that the third of them became darkened, and the day did not brighten for a third of it, and the night likewise. As you can see, that the plague of the four trumpets strikes a third of the sun, moon, and stars, causing darkness on the third of the earth. And this scene certainly evokes the ninth plague, which brought darkness about the land of Egypt. In the Old Testament, the darkness of the celestial bodies signified the coming of God's judgment on the unfaithful. Darkness is also a symbol of apostasy and the absence of the gospel and truth. Light in the New Testament, on the opposite side, stands for the gospel. Jesus is true light. The gospel brings the light to the people. In such context, the darkness is the absence of the gospel. When people reject the gospel and choose darkness, they bring the judgment upon himself. And this is the best way expressed by Jesus in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 19. Jesus says, this is the judgment, that the light has come to the world, And the man loved the darkness rather than the light. Really, these words of Jesus in John 3, verse 19, in the best possible way, describes the condition of the world during the period of the dark Middle Ages and its final period of history. The Reformation, God raised in the 16th century, rediscovered the gospel and restored the teachings of the Bible, and restored the Bible as the rule of faith and teaching. However, this generation of Reformation, we can name them by names, were succeeded by the lifeless generations of so-called Protestant scholastics, which were characterized by the same spirit as the medieval church, characterized by theological polemics and controversies. Christianity became less a matter of personal relationship with Christ, but more a matter of the membership in the church and everybody who dared to oppose the official teaching of that state church, Protestant state church at the time, was a subject of persecution and mistreatment. And this situation that happened in the post-medieval period had a mortifying effect on Christianity. While the Reformation marked the end of religion's dominance over the minds of the people at the beginning of the intellectual revolution in Europe during the 17th and 18th century, the age of enlightenment, or the age of reason, resulted with the French Revolution ending the dominance of Christian faith in the Western world. And such situation led to the rise of rationalism, skepticism, humanism, liberalism, which ultimately gave birth to secularism. We have to admit that all of these, like secularism, had a great impact on science, politics, religious liberty, arts, education. However, with its materialistic orientation, denial of supernaturalism, skepticism toward the faith of any kind, and emphasis on human beings and the human efforts, secularism replaced the authority of the Bible and Christian faith for human reason. So the negative aspect of secularism gradually eroded the Christian faith and robbed millions of the hope of salvation. So the fourth trumpet must be understood the best possible way as describing the darkening of the spiritual source of the true light under the prevailing influence of secularism following at the end of the medieval period and following the Middle Ages. The singular effect of the fourth trumpet plague is partial darkening, 1/3. It not completely obliterated the gospel message, providing the spiritual light. The deepening of that darkness and its dreadful consequences become more evident in the following period portrayed in the scenes of the fifth trumpet. People had to reap the choice of their actions. So in the context of the book of Revelation, the situation among people and the absence of the gospel, the absence of any spiritual matter in the lives of the people, it's in the book of Revelation in the best way portrayed as God's judgment that was bestowed on the people, when people separate from God, they have to reap the consequences of their action. In our next presentations, we will see the further development of the consequences and deepening this dark situation of the aspects of the Gospels among the people, leading to our time in which we live today. So see you at our next presentations, hoping to get much better and deeper insight into the meaning of the seven trumpets as the divine judgments upon the people who reject the gospel message and turn away from God. So see you next time. Until then, may God bless you and be with you.